The helicopter left us on the ridge with only the roaring wind and our gear. Ahead, the research station loomed, a cluster of weather-beaten structures half buried in snow. It wasn't supposed to be abandoned, not entirely. But for the past 6 months, the facility had gone silent. No responses to communications, no signs of life from the automated systems. We were here to find out why. There were 3 of us: Dr. Hannah Voss, our lead glaciologist, Nick, an experienced field technician, and me, a journalist tagging along for what was supposed to be a groundbreaking article. The station's work, studying melting ice cores for ancient microbial life, had been making headlines. Then one day, nothing. The first sign that something was off came when we reached the main building. The snowdrifts against the door were undisturbed, but the lock had been broken from the inside. The heavy metal door swung open with a groan, revealing a dark hallway lined with frost. "Power's out," Nick muttered, switching on his flashlight. His beam revealed peeling walls and scattered debris, overturned chairs, a broken laptop, empty ration wrappers. "Where is everyone?" Hannah asked, her voice tight. "Maybe they evacuated," I suggested, though the cold knot in my stomach told me otherwise. We started with the common areas. The station was eerily silent, the only sounds the crunch of our boots on ice and the occasional groan of the wind. In the mess hall, plates and cups were still on the tables, frozen in time. The food had long since spoiled, but it was clear the team hadn't planned to leave in a hurry. "Check this out," Nick said, pointing to a whiteboard on the wall. It was covered in scrawled notes about experiments, weather data. And then, near the bottom, a single word repeated over and over: "Stop." "What the hell does that mean?" I asked. Hannah frowned. "It could be anything. Stress, exhaustion. People can lose it out here." She was trying to sound rational, but her grip tightened on the strap of her pack. We moved to the lab where the real work had been done. The room was in chaos, cabinets flung open, papers scattered everywhere. The freezer units used to store ice cores had been emptied, the samples nowhere to be found. "This doesn't make sense," Hannah said, kneeling beside a toppled microscope. "These samples were the whole reason for this station. Why would they take them?" "Maybe they didn't," Nick replied, his voice grim. "What's that supposed to mean?" He didn't answer, just gestured toward the far corner of the room. A hatch led down to the storage level. It was open, the ladder rimmed with frost. "Someone went down there," Nick said. "Or something came up," I muttered under my breath. The hatch led to a series of narrow corridors, colder than the levels above. The walls were lined with pipes, some of them leaking slow drips of icy water. Our breaths clouded in front of us as we moved deeper into the station. At the end of the corridor, we found the first body. He was slumped against the wall, his face pale and frozen. His name tag read Dr. Kaminsky. Beside him was a rifle, its barrel smeared with something dark and oily. His gloved hand clutched a small notebook, the pages stiff with frost. Nick pried it free and flipped it open. The writing was shaky, erratic, but one line stood out. "We were wrong. It isn't dormant." "What isn't dormant?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe it's just paranoia," Hannah said, though her face had gone pale. Nick knelt beside Kaminsky, inspecting the rifle. "Looks like he fired this, recently." "At what?" We pressed on, though every instinct screamed at me to turn back. The corridor opened into the cold storage room, where the station had kept its ice core samples. The freezers were smashed, shards of glass glittering on the floor. Hannah knelt beside one of the shattered cases. "Look at this," she said, holding up a piece of glass. It was pitted, corroded, as though something had eaten away at it. "What could do that?" I asked. Before she could answer, Nick froze. "Did you hear that?" We all went still, straining to listen. Faintly, from somewhere deeper in the station, came a sound, a low, wet scraping, like something being dragged across the floor. My pulse quickened. "What the hell is that?" "Probably just the wind," Hannah said, though her voice lacked conviction. Nick shook his head. "No, that's coming from the core lab." The core lab was the station's heart, where the team had studied samples pulled from the ice. The door was ajar, the edges frosted over. Nick pushed it open, and the smell hit us, a sharp, metallic tang that made my stomach churn. The lab was wrecked. Equipment lay in ruins, the floor slick with water and something else. In the center of the room was a large containment tank, its thick glass walls shattered. "What were they keeping in there?" I asked. my voice trembling. Hannah shook her head. This isn't right. The samples, whatever they found, it wasn't supposed to be alive. Before anyone could respond, the scraping sound came again, louder this time, and closer. Nick raised the rifle he'd taken from Kaminsky's body, his eyes darting around the room. "We need to leave, now." "But," Hannah began, but he cut her off. "Whatever happened here, it's not over. We're not sticking around to find out what's still down here." We turned to leave, but the sound followed us, echoing through the corridors. It was relentless, growing louder with every step. At the hatch, Nick climbed up first, his rifle slung over his shoulder. I went next, with Hannah close behind. Just as she reached the top, a shadow moved at the edge of my vision. "Go!" I shouted, pushing her forward. Nick slammed the hatch shut, twisting the lock into place. For a moment, we stood there, breathless and shaking. Then came the sound of something pounding against the hatch from below. It didn't stop until we left the station. We never spoke about what happened. The official report cited a mechanical failure and extreme weather conditions as the cause of the station's abandonment. No mention was made of Kaminsky, the shattered containment tank, or the thing in the storage level. I never wrote the article. Some stories are better left untold. But every now and then I wonder, what did they find in the ice? And is it still there, waiting for someone else to uncover it? Before we dive into the next story, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us. Thanks for watching. It's strange how a whim can change your life, isn't it? 8 years ago, I was just a bored 20-something with too much time on my hands and a budding fascination with urban exploration. Back then, urbex was gaining traction online. Gritty photos of abandoned places, frozen in decay. I wasn't much of a photographer, but I liked the thrill of sneaking into forgotten spaces, imagining their histories. That's how I ended up at the old Braxton textile mill. The mill had been the lifeblood of a small town about 2 hours from where I lived. It shut down in the late 80s, like so many other factories, when cheap labor overseas crushed local industry. I'd read online that it was a gold mine for urbex enthusiasts, an enormous, crumbling structure filled with ancient machinery, peeling paint, and that eerie sense of time standing still. I convinced 2 friends to come along. Danny, my college roommate, and Serena, who I'd met through a local photography group. Serena was the bold one, always up for a challenge. Danny, on the other hand, was cautious, the type to double-check if we locked the car doors. We arrived at the mill on a drizzly October afternoon. The gray sky made the building look even more desolate, its broken windows staring back like hollow eyes. Rust streaked the brick walls and weeds had taken over the loading dock. A faded sign above the entrance read Braxton Mills, Est, 1924, though most of the letters had fallen off. "Creepy as hell," Danny muttered as we climbed through a gap in the chain-link fence. "Perfect," Serena replied, grinning as she adjusted her camera strap. Inside, the air was damp and heavy, carrying the scent of mildew and machine oil. The main floor was cavernous, with rows of rusted looms stretching into the shadows. Piles of old fabric scraps littered the floor, alongside overturned chairs and waterlogged paperwork. It was like the workers had simply vanished mid-shift, leaving everything behind. We split up to explore. Serena headed toward the offices, excited about a file cabinet she'd spotted, while Danny and I stuck to the factory floor. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, but I chalked it up to nerves. These places always had a way of getting under your skin. We found a break room with faded posters on the walls. "Safety first," and "Take pride in your work," and a moldy couch that looked like it had been there since the 70s. Danny picked up a mug from the table, its rim crusted with grime. "Think this is haunted?" he joked, turning the mug over. "Haunted by bad coffee," I replied, but my laugh sounded hollow. Things got stranger as we went deeper into the mill. In a side room, we found a locker with the door wrenched off. Inside was a pile of clothes, neatly folded, and a pair of boots. They didn't look as old as they should have. "Maybe someone's squatting here," Danny suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "Let's hope they're friendly," I said, trying to make light of it. We caught up with Serena in the offices, where she was poring over ledgers and time cards. "Check this out," she said, holding up a yellowed sheet of paper. It was a shift schedule, dated November 15th, 1987, the mill's last day of operation. Everyone's name is here, but there's no clock-out time for any of them, like they just left. Or were made to leave, Danny added, looking uneasy. That's when we heard the first sound, an echoing clang from somewhere below us. What the hell was that? Serena whispered. Probably just the building settling, I said, though my pulse quickened. The three of us exchanged nervous glances, but decided to investigate. We found a stairwell leading to the basement, where the air grew colder and the smell of damp concrete hit us like a wall. The clang came again, louder this time, and I could have sworn I heard faint shuffling. The basement was a maze of pipes and old machinery. Our flashlights barely cut through the darkness, and the sound of dripping water echoed around us. Then we saw it, a faint light flickering at the end of a hallway. "Who's there?" Danny called out, his voice trembling. No response. We crept closer, and that's when we saw the figure. A man, hunched over and filthy, was tinkering with one of the machines. He looked up as our flashlight beams hit him, his face gaunt and wild-eyed. "Leave," he growled, his voice raspy and low. "We didn't mean to." Serena started, but he cut her off. "Leave now!" He lunged toward us, brandishing a heavy wrench. We bolted, adrenaline surging. I could hear him yelling behind us, his footsteps slamming against the concrete. We scrambled up the stairs, my heart hammering as I prayed he wouldn't catch us. Back on the main floor, we didn't stop. We ran for the nearest exit, Danny pausing just long enough to push open a rusty door. Outside, the rain had started to fall harder, the cold droplets stinging my face as we sprinted for the car. When we finally reached it, we piled in, breathless and shaking. Serena locked the doors while Danny fumbled with the keys, nearly dropping them in his panic. As we sped away, none of us spoke for a long time. My mind raced, replaying the encounter. Who was that man? A squatter? A former worker who never left? I couldn't help but wonder how long he'd been down there, surviving in the dark, clinging to a life no one else remembered. We never reported it. What would we even say? Instead, we quietly agreed to never return to the Braxton Mill. Serena stopped posting her photos online after that, and Danny gave up urbex altogether. As for me, I still think about it sometimes. I've visited other abandoned places since then, but I'm more cautious now. Every creak, every shadow makes me wonder who or what might be lurking in the darkness. Because the scariest thing about that day wasn't the man himself. It was realizing that the past doesn't always stay buried, and some places are abandoned for a reason. I had been driving for hours, trying to find my way to a small town where an old friend lived. My GPS wasn't working, and the back roads seemed endless. Trees lined both sides of the gravel road, their branches weaving together overhead, casting dark shadows. The sun was low, and I hadn't seen a single house or person for miles. That's when I saw it, a farmhouse. It was off the main road, surrounded by overgrown fields. The paint was peeling, and the windows were either boarded up or covered in grime. I was low on gas, so I thought I'd stop and see if anyone lived there. Maybe they had a phone or directions to the nearest gas station. I pulled up the dirt driveway, the crunch of gravel breaking the silence. The place looked abandoned. The porch steps were sagging, and weeds grew through the cracks in the foundation. But there was something odd. The front door was slightly open. I got out of the car and called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" My voice echoed in the stillness. No answer. Curiosity got the better of me. Inside, the house smelled musty, like wet wood and something sour. Dust covered everything. The floor, the furniture, even the air felt thick with it. There was a table in the middle of the living room, its surface warped from water damage. A few chairs were scattered around, one of them broken. I walked further in, noticing details that made the place feel unsettling. On the wall by the kitchen, there were old family photos. A man, a woman, and 2 kids. The photos were faded, but you could still make out their faces. They looked happy. It was hard to imagine that family ever living here. The kitchen was worse. Rusted cans sat on the counter, their labels barely legible. A fridge stood in the corner with its door hanging open. Inside were jars filled with something unrecognizable, their lids rusted shut. Then I noticed a set of children's drawings pinned to the wall. Crayons on yellowing paper. A family standing together under a bright sun. But in one of the pictures, the father was crossed out with thick black lines. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I thought about leaving, but a noise stopped me. A soft creak from upstairs. It wasn't loud, but in the silence, it might as well have been a gunshot. "Hello?" I called again, my voice shaking a little. No answer. I told myself it was probably just the wind, maybe a loose window shutter. Still, I found myself climbing the stairs. Each step groaned under my weight. At the top, there were 3 doors. One was ajar, revealing what used to be a bedroom. The other 2 were closed. I stepped into the open room first. The bed was still there, its mattress stained and sagging. A child's toy, a stuffed bear with one eye missing, sat in the corner, covered in cobwebs. The closet door was slightly open, and I hesitated before pulling it wider. Inside were clothes, small and old, hanging limply on wire hangers. But there was something else, a small box on the floor. I opened it and found a handful of Polaroid photos. The pictures were strange. They showed parts of the house, the kitchen, the living room, even the stairs I had just climbed. But they looked recent. The dust and decay were exactly as I'd seen them. Someone had been here. I backed out of the room and moved to the next door. It was locked. I jiggled the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Something heavy was leaning against it from the other side. Then I heard it again. The creak. This time it was closer, like it came from just down the hall. The last door was slightly open, so I nudged it wider. It was another bedroom, but this one looked different. There were no toys or clothes, just a bed frame and a chair in the middle of the room. On the chair sat a notebook. I picked it up, flipping through the pages. Most of it was scribbles, incoherent ramblings about people coming to take it away. The last few pages were drawings, similar to the ones downstairs, but darker. In these, the family wasn't smiling. The father's face was scratched out in every one. Then I heard the floor creak again. This time it was directly behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but the hall was empty. My breath caught in my throat as I backed into the room. My hands shook as I set the notebook down. Something felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but it was like I wasn't supposed to be here. I decided to leave. Forget finding gas or directions. I just needed to get out. As I stepped back into the hallway, I froze. The door to the locked room was now slightly open. My chest tightened, but I couldn't stop myself from looking. I pushed the door open slowly. Inside, the room was nearly bare, except for a pile of blankets in the corner. They were filthy, but they moved. Someone was under them. "Hey!" I shouted, more out of fear than anything. The blankets stopped moving. I took a step back, my hands shaking. Then the blankets shifted, and a face peeked out. It was a man, his eyes wild and bloodshot, his hair matted. He looked thin, like he hadn't eaten in weeks. "What are you doing here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer. He just stared at me, unblinking. Then he grinned, his teeth yellow and jagged. I didn't wait for him to say anything. I bolted down the stairs, nearly tripping in my rush. I ran out the door, jumped into my car, and started it. As I sped down the driveway, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The man was standing on the porch, watching me, still grinning. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town, where I finally found a gas station. I told the clerk about the farmhouse. "Oh, that place," he said, shaking his head. "Yeah, some homeless guy stays there now and then. He's harmless, but creepy as hell. Folks around here stay away from there." I didn't say anything about the man's grin or the photos in the box. I just nodded, bought my gas, and got back on the road. I still think about that farmhouse sometimes. It wasn't haunted. There were no ghosts or monsters. But the man I saw? He was real. And that's scarier than anything else. 8 years ago, I learned the hard way that nature doesn't care about your plans. I'd only been dating Lena for 6 months when she invited me on a weekend hiking trip. She was the adventurous type, always looking for the next challenge. Me? I was a desk job guy, more comfortable with air conditioning and Wi-Fi than trails and backpacks. But I liked Lena, and I wanted to impress her. She chose the Tanglewood Trail, a moderate loop deep in a national forest she'd visited as a kid. "It's beautiful," she told me, her eyes lighting up as she described waterfalls, rocky overlooks, and endless miles of towering trees. I was nervous but excited until everything went wrong. The plan was simple: hike to a campsite, spend the night, and loop back the next day. We started out late in the morning, with Lena navigating. She was confident, checking the map only occasionally, while I trudged along behind her, already feeling the strain of my overloaded pack. By mid-afternoon, the weather shifted. A cold wind swept through the forest, and the overcast sky darkened ominously. "We need to pick up the pace," Lena said, frowning. "I don't want to get caught in the rain." We hurried, but the trail markers became harder to spot, obscured by fallen leaves and overgrowth. Hours passed, and the campsite Lena swore she remembered never appeared. "I think we took a wrong turn," she admitted as the first raindrops splattered against my jacket. "Think or no?" I asked, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. She shot me a glare but didn't answer. The drizzle turned into a steady downpour, and the trail vanished beneath a carpet of wet leaves and mud. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, we were soaked, freezing, and utterly lost. That's when we saw it. A small cabin loomed out of the gloom, its outline barely visible through the dense trees. It wasn't on any map, and its appearance felt sudden, like it had materialized from the shadows. The cabin looked ancient, with warped wooden walls and a sagging roof, but there was a faint flicker of light in the window. "Do you think someone's inside?" I asked, my teeth chattering. "We don't have a choice," Lena said, trudging toward it. We approached the cabin cautiously. It felt wrong somehow, too convenient. A lifeline in the middle of nowhere, just when we needed it most. But the rain was unrelenting, and the cold was sinking into my bones. By the time we reached the door, my hesitation was replaced by desperation. Lena knocked, the sound hollow against the warped wood. No response. She knocked again, louder this time. "Hello," she called, her voice wavering. Still nothing. "Maybe it's abandoned," I said, glancing over my shoulder at the dark forest. "Or maybe they're out. We'll leave a note explaining," she replied, and with that, she pushed the door open. The air inside was warmer, thick with the smell of damp wood and ash. A small fire crackled weakly in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows across the single room. The furnishings were sparse: a rickety table, 2 mismatched chairs, and a cot against the far wall. Everything was coated in a thin layer of grime, as though someone had lived there once but hadn't cared to clean in years. "This feels weird," I murmured, stepping inside. "Yeah, well, hypothermia's weirder," Lena said, shrugging off her wet jacket. She had a point. The fire was too inviting to ignore, so I closed the door behind us and sat near the hearth, letting the warmth creep back into my fingers. Lena explored the cabin, opening cabinets and drawers. "Whoever lived here didn't leave much," she said. "Cans of beans, a rusted knife, and What?" She held up a yellowed piece of paper she'd found tucked beneath a stack of chipped plates. It was handwritten, scrawled in a shaky script. "Do not stay after dark." My stomach tightened. Great. A warning in a creepy cabin. That's just what we need. Lena smirked, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Probably just someone messing with trespassers. Don't read too much into it." I wasn't convinced, but the fire and dry shelter were hard to argue with. We decided to stay until the rain eased up, then find our way back to the trail. But the rain didn't stop. Night fell, and the cabin grew eerily quiet. The wind howled outside, rattling the loose window panes, but inside it was deathly still. I busied myself with drying our clothes by the fire while Lena tried to decipher the map again. "That warning," I said finally, breaking the silence. "Why would someone leave that here?" Lena sighed. "You're overthinking it. Maybe it's from years ago, left by someone superstitious. Or someone with a reason," I muttered, glancing toward the shadowy corners of the room. Lena didn't answer. As the hours dragged on, the unease in my chest grew heavier. The cabin felt too quiet, the firelight too dim. At some point, I thought I heard a creak, like a floorboard groaning under weight, but when I looked, nothing was there. "We need to sleep," Lena said, breaking me out of my thoughts. I nodded reluctantly. We laid out our sleeping bags near the fire, but sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I was being watched. I don't know what woke me up. A noise, maybe, or a shift in the air. The fire had burned low, the room bathed in faint, flickering shadows. I sat up, blinking blearily. Lena was still asleep beside me, and then I saw it. The door. It was ajar. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. I was certain I'd closed it before we settled in. As quietly as I could, I nudged Lena awake. She blinked up at me groggily. "What?" I held a finger to my lips, then pointed to the door. Her eyes widened as she realized what I was saying. We both listened, straining to hear past the crackle of the dying fire. At first there was nothing. Then, faintly, the sound of movement, slow, deliberate footsteps on the porch. Lena grabbed the rusted knife from earlier, her grip white-knuckled. I reached for the closest thing I could use as a weapon, a heavy iron poker from beside the fireplace. The footsteps stopped. For a moment there was silence. Then the door creaked open wider. "Who's there?" Lena called, her voice trembling but steady. No response. A shadow appeared in the doorway, tall and hunched. My breath caught in my throat as the figure stepped into the cabin. It was a man, or what was left of one. His clothes were filthy and torn, his face gaunt and weathered. His eyes, though, those were what terrified me. They were hollow, unblinking, like he'd forgotten how to be human. "Get out," Lena said, raising the knife. He didn't speak. He just stared at us, tilting his head slightly as if confused. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, he lunged. Lena screamed, and I swung the poker with everything I had. It connected with a sickening crack, and the man stumbled back, clutching his head. "Go!" Lena yelled, grabbing my arm. We bolted, leaving everything behind. The rain was still falling, the forest a pitch-black labyrinth, but fear drove us forward. I didn't dare look back, afraid of what I might see or not see. We found the trail just as dawn broke, the pale light revealing the way back to the parking lot. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. Neither of us spoke on the drive home. We never reported the incident. Who would believe us? Instead, we tried to put it behind us, but I still dream about that cabin sometimes. About the man with the hollow eyes and the strange warning on the paper. Lena and I broke up a few months later. She said I'd become too paranoid, too jumpy. Maybe she was right, but sometimes late at night I wonder, what would have happened if we hadn't left? And I wonder if the man is still there, waiting for the next hikers to lose their way.